Okay, so Thomas Aquinas, born in 1224 or 1225 in Italy, north of Naples. His family is members of the lesser nobility. So remember we talked about feudalism. He's not a serf or anything like that. His family is pretty well off. They send him to become educated at a Benedictine monastery. We talked about the Benedictine monks before, and he enters his what we call the Studium Generale, which is just the term that they used for university back then, in 1238. And when he enters his university studies, he becomes acquainted with some members of this new monastic order called the Dominicans. And I'm sure you can imagine what happens after that. He's swayed by these Dominicans. He wants to join them. A little bit about the Dominicans and who they are. They're they're very interested in the intersection of philosophy and theology. They are into the new works of Aristotle, right? So the the texts that have been translated and commentated on by Averroes have made their way to Europe, right? And so these Dominicans are really interested in those translations. Aristotle, who we don't talk about, but is a student of Plato's. And because Aristotle is an ancient Greek, he's a pagan, and his works are seen as a threat to Catholicism. But the Dominicans don't see Aristotle this way, so they're trying to find a way to sort of mesh Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. Aquinas likes the Dominican order so much that he decides to join them, but his family is super upset about that because they want him to join a Benedictine order and eventually become an abbot, right? So he would kind of rise up through the ranks of the church, and they think it's below him to be a monk, and so they hate this idea so much that they imprison him his family imprisons him in a castle for a year. And they won't let him out. They're like, oh, you want to join the Dominicans? Well, we're just gonna lock you in this castle, which I think is super crazy. But he and like they try to like tempt him, and get him to not want to join the Dominicans, but he doesn't waver. And finally, they let him leave. He begins his novitiate, and he studies under this great German Dominican theologian named Albert the Great. Aquinas starts working on the Summa, which is we call it the Summa Theologiae, or the Summary of Theology, in 1266, and it's meant to be a textbook. Like Aquinas is reading all of this stuff, and he's like, "There's not a really good textbook on theology for the novice Dominicans," so he's basically writing a textbook. I know that this book is also really dry, and it's really dry because he tried to write a textbook. So it's not one of the more like riveting things that we read, but I think I can sort of make it interesting. So we'll talk a little bit first about the format of the Summa. We break it down into questions, objections, and replies. And I know this is a really weird way of reading something, but if you look, you can see how this sort of shakes out if you look at the treatise on law, and that begins on page 44. And so all these questions are numbered, so the essence of law is question 90. And these questions have like sub-questions. So Aquinas, writes question 3 out as can any person make law? So then he gives these objections. He gives 3 objections. They're listed as objection 1, objection 2, and objection 3 to the question. But he hasn't given like an argument yet, so it's kind of weird. Then, after he gives the objections, he addresses a counter-argument. The counter-argument usually refers to some kind of authoritative literature. A lot of times it's the Bible, but sometimes it's Aristotle. And then Aquinas gives his answer, his reply. He says, I answer that. And that's where his actual argument comes in. So when you look at a text like this, it can be really difficult to kind of figure out like what Aquinas is actually arguing for, because there are all these counter arguments and objections. But anytime you see him say, I answer that, that's where his view comes in. And then he replies to the objections that he laid out before. So the format is a little strange, but once you sort of know each part and know what you're looking for, I think it all makes a little more sense. Anytime you see Aquinas refer to the philosopher capitalized in the Summa, he's talking about Aristotle. If he refers to the commentator, he's talking about Averroes, right? Because he's the one who did the commentaries on Aristotle's work that got translated into Latin. He appeals to other authorities as well. The theologian Peter Lombard, he calls him the master. He calls St. Augustine the theologian. So you've got other authorities in there. So if he ever refers to any of these people, that's who he's talking about. Aquinas believes, and this is sort of the central tenet of scholasticism, that there are two ways of arriving at truths about the world. You have truths based on reason, like human rationality, and then on the other hand, you have truths that are based on revelation. And revelation refers to these divinely revealed truths that are not available to reason. So things that are listed in the New Testament as truths that humans don't experience, for example. So remember again that Aquinas is living during a time where Aristotle's teachings have become really popular because they've rediscovered them. So he makes a lot of use of these in his theological work. Scholasticism is basically this marriage of faith and reason. So, the textbook definition of scholasticism is that it's a standardized logical method of treating philosophical questions, which tries to resolve what are seen as logical contradictions or disputed problems. So it's this attempted synthesis of Christian faith and Aristotelian philosophy, because the Dominicans like the ideas of Aristotle, and they think that they're really useful and valuable, but as they stand, they kind of don't fit really well in with Christian theology. Again, Aristotle's not a Christian because he lives before Christianity. He's a pagan. So Aquinas and these other scholastic thinkers are using Aristotle's analytic methods to demonstrate that there actually isn't an incompatibility, like a fundamental incompatibility between the philosophy of Aristotle and the Christian faith. And I think that the best way you can see all of this play out is by looking at the proofs for God's existence. So one of the big things that Aquinas tries to do in the Summa is establish like this scientific or logical rational proof for God's existence. Like so he's trying to prove to us that God exists, not by using the Holy Scripture as the proof, but by giving us these rational arguments. And he specifically, in these proofs, he's trying to answer this guy named St. Anselm, who had given this ontological proof, which was really crappy. The ontological proof basically goes like this: God is the greatest possible being, and if a being fails to exist in the actual world, he's less perfect than a being who exists in all possible worlds, therefore God has to necessarily exist. Aquinas thinks this proof is kind of dumb, and he wants to respond to that and also pull in some scholasticism here. So what he does is he gives us 5 proofs for God's existence. I'm going to walk through these kind of quickly, but if you have any questions on them, let me know. The first argument is really, really Aristotelian. Basically, Aquinas starts from the premise that things in the world are in motion, and you just sort of observe the world and see that that's the case. And everything, he then determines that everything that is in motion has to be moved by something. There's this really crazy Aristotelian stuff about potentiality going on here, but basically, if you think of like a row of dominoes, they're not going to fall over unless someone knocks them over, right? Or a gust of wind knocks them over, or something like that. Basically, if things are in motion, something had to have put them into motion. Aquinas says it's not the case that there are an infinite series of movers, and there must have been somebody who set all of the motion into motion the first time. So there must have been what we call a prime mover or a first mover, and obviously this is God. So the way you think about this in layman's terms is that things move and things change. God is the person who set, or God is the entity that set the universe in motion, so he is that prime mover. The second argument, also really Aristotelian, we call it the argument from efficient cause, and this one states that nothing can be prior to itself. So everything has to be caused by something, basically. There can't be an infinite series of causes. There has to be something that caused everything. And of course, Aquinas says God is the cause of everything. So again, you have like this notion of cause and effect. You can't have the latter without the former. There's some Aristotelian language in there when he talks about efficient cause. But Aquinas and Aristotle both agree that there can't be this endless regression of cause and effect. So there has to have been a first cause. Of course, it has to be God from Aquinas' perspective. The argument from modality reads that things in nature are contingent. Like, it's not necessary that they all exist. It's just kind of accidental, like that there's a tree sitting right there out of my window. And since there are things that are contingent, there has to be some kind of necessary thing that could not have failed to exist. If you know what a counterfactual is, this is kind of an argument based on counterfactuals. So he says there has to be something that's necessary, the necessary being is God. This one is weird. So, things exist, but they easily could not exist. There was a time before many things existed. There will be a time when things no longer exist. There also has to have been a time when nothing existed. So, for Aquinas, the only thing that has always existed must be God. And therefore God has this necessary existence. So if God didn't exist, nothing else would exist. The fourth proof is this, what we call from the argument from gradation. This one's kind of a Platonistic argument. Basically, he says things in nature exist in degrees, and if something occurs in degrees, it has to be comparable to some kind of maximum. So if you imagine like animals in nature, there are some animals that are slow, and there are some animals that are fast, and there are some animals that are super fast, right? Basically Aquinas says there has to be like a cap, right? And not only are there caps to things like fastness and slowness, but there's a cap to goodness, to perfection. So he thinks that since there are things that exist in degrees and there's a maximum of everything, there has to be a maximum of goodness. The maximum of goodness is obviously God. So if you look at the world in degrees of perfection and goodness, some things are bad, some things are really bad, some things are horrible, some things are not so bad, and some things are better than others. So if we are talking about humans here, humans have the capacity for good and bad deeds, so they can't be the source of goodness, right? Because humans can do bad, therefore they cannot be the most good things. So the maximum goodness has to refer to something non-human, and not in this world, and that leaves us with God. The fifth argument looks like an argument from intelligent design. So, we call it the proof from the order of the universe, and it states that there has to be, nature is orderly, naturally. It seems to function according to a purpose. And for Aquinas, anything that has a purpose requires the aid of some kind of guiding hand. So if you're thinking about an arrow, it only hits the target because it's been fired by an archer. It doesn't randomly hit targets. So if nature appears ordered, it must have some kind of guiding hand, and Aquinas believes that guiding hand is God. So I'll end that one here with all of the proofs. And so you can kind of see how the scholastic idea shakes out, where you're trying to establish this truth that is, typically just based on revealed scripture or faith, but Aquinas is trying to give us this scientific perspective on God's existence. So I'll stop that one there, and then we'll continue.